The mess hall is loud. Trays clattering, men laughing, the smell of food and salt air mixing together the way it always does on a Navy base. Hundreds of sailors packed into long rows of tables, eating fast the way military people do, because time is never really yours when you wear a uniform. Nobody is paying attention to the man in the corner. He's sitting alone. No fuss, no announcement. Just a tray of food and a quiet presence that most people would walk right past without a second look. But there is something different about this man. Something in the way he sits. Completely still. Back straight. Eyes that don't dart around the room the way nervous people's do. He watches everything without looking like he's watching anything. That man is Seagal. And in about 6 seconds, this entire mess hall is going to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Now before we get there, let me tell you something important. Because this story isn't really just about a fight. It's about something deeper. Something that has to do with ego and respect, and what happens when someone mistakes calmness for weakness. And trust me, that mistake gets made all the time. Maybe you've even seen it happen. Maybe it's happened to you. But first, let's set the scene properly. Steven Seagal in the early days wasn't famous yet. No movies. No Hollywood. Just a man who had spent years in Japan studying Aikido at a level that almost no Westerner had ever reached. He became the first foreigner in history to operate his own Aikido dojo in Japan. Let that sink in. In a country where martial arts tradition goes back centuries, where masters spend lifetimes earning respect, this American walked in and earned something almost nobody from outside ever had. He came back to the United States carrying something invisible but very real. A kind of understanding about force, about energy, about how to move through conflict without burning yourself up in the process. But the men in this mess hall don't know any of that. All they see is a quiet guy sitting alone. And one sailor decides that's funny. Now let me pause here for just a second, because I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever judged someone by how quiet they were? Have you ever assumed that a person who doesn't brag, doesn't show off, doesn't make noise, must not have anything worth paying attention to? Think about that. Because that assumption is exactly what's about to cost this sailor in a very big way. The sailor is the kind of guy who fills up a room. Loud laugh. Big personality. The type who always has an audience and knows it. He walks through the mess hall like he owns it, and the men around him feed into that energy the way groups always do. Someone laughs at his joke. Someone slaps the table. The room shifts its attention toward him the way sunflowers turn toward light. He spots Seagal. Something about that quiet stillness irritates him. Maybe it looks like arrogance to him. Maybe it looks like someone who thinks they're too good to join the noise. Maybe he just wants a reaction, because reactions are what people like him feed on. He walks over, and he shoves Steven Seagal. Not a tap, not a joke push. A real shove. The kind meant to move a person, meant to embarrass them in front of everyone, meant to say without words, you are not special here. The mess hall goes quiet. And here is where the 6 seconds begin. Now, I need you to understand something about those 6 seconds, because they contain an entire lesson that most people never learn in their whole lives. When ordinary people get shoved in public, especially in front of a crowd, one of two things usually happens. They either freeze up because their brain is overwhelmed and they don't know what to do, or they explode with anger because their ego takes over and suddenly all they can think about is not looking weak. Neither of those things happen with Steven Seagal. Zero panic, zero anger, zero wasted energy. What happens instead is something that the men in that room would describe for years afterward with the same word. Effortless. Before the sailor even fully processes what he just did, before his hand has barely left Seagal's shoulder, something shifts. The air in the room changes. Not because of noise or chaos. Because of the complete absence of it. Seagal moves. Not in the way action movies train us to expect. No big wind-up. No dramatic expression. No moment where you can see the decision being made. Just movement. Clean, quiet, and completely inevitable. The way water moves when you tip a glass. The sailor is a big man. Strong. Confident in that strength the way people are when they've never met its limit. That confidence evaporates in approximately the time it takes to blink. One moment he is standing, feeling powerful, feeling like the center of the room. The next moment he is on the ground. He doesn't fully understand how he got there. That's the thing about real Aikido at the highest level. It doesn't fight force with force. It doesn't meet a shove with a punch. It takes the energy coming toward it and redirects it so smoothly that the person on the receiving end almost feels confused, like the ground came up to meet them instead of someone putting them there. The mess hall is completely silent. Not the silence of shock, though there is plenty of that. The silence of understanding. The kind that settles over a crowd when they all realize at the same moment that they just witnessed something they do not have the words for yet. The sailor is on the floor. Seagal is standing exactly where he was standing before. And then, this is the part that people talk about the most. Seagal reaches down and helps the man up. No victory speech. No standing over him. No letting the crowd cheer. He simply reaches out a hand, lifts the man back to his feet, and returns to his meal. Like nothing happened. Like nothing needed to happen. And right there, in that simple gesture, is the real lesson of this entire story. Let me ask you something. Why do you think that moment, helping the man up, is the part people remember more than the takedown itself? Think about it. Comment below. Because I think most people know the answer even if they've never put it into words. Now let's talk about what this moment actually says about Steven Seagal, because the story goes deeper than most people realize. Seagal didn't go to that base to impress anyone. He wasn't there to demonstrate anything. He wasn't looking for a stage. There are people in this world who are loud about what they can do, and there are people who simply carry it with them quietly. Seagal, at least in this chapter of his life, was firmly in the second category. This is one of the things that made him genuinely unique in the world of martial arts. Most people who reach a high level of skill have a very hard time not showing it. The ego gets attached to the ability. The training becomes about identity, about proving something, about being seen. And that's understandable. Humans are wired that way. But real mastery, the kind that gets talked about in ancient texts and whispered about by teachers who've seen it, real mastery is almost invisible. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. And when it's forced to appear, it appears completely, without drama, and then it goes quiet again immediately. That's what those sailors saw that day, and that's why they never forgot it. Now let me tell you about the other side of this story, because there's something important here about the sailor too. And I don't mean this in a cruel way. That young man made a mistake that millions of people make every single day. He read the surface and thought he was reading the whole book. He saw quiet and thought weak. He saw stillness and thought empty. He looked at a man sitting alone in a loud room and decided that meant something about that man's value. We all do this. Maybe not with shoving people, but in smaller ways, every single day. We make judgments based on surfaces. We decide who matters and who doesn't based on noise level and confidence posture and whether someone commands the room or sits quietly at the edge of it. And sometimes life arranges itself to correct that assumption in a way you will never forget. For that sailor, the correction took 6 seconds. Think about a time in your own life when you misjudged someone based on how quiet or calm they seemed. Did it teach you something? Tell me in the comments. Honestly, because I think more people have a story like this than they realize. Now, after this incident, something interesting happened. Word spread. It always does on a military base. Within hours, the story had traveled through the barracks, the training areas, the offices. By the next morning, the entire base knew. But here's what's fascinating about how the story traveled. It didn't travel as a story of humiliation. It didn't travel as gossip about someone getting beaten up. It traveled as something closer to legend. Because the detail that everyone kept coming back to, the detail that got repeated every single time the story was told, was not the takedown. It was the hand extended downward, the sailor being lifted back up, the quiet return to the meal. That one gesture did something remarkable. It removed the story from the category of fight and placed it firmly in the category of character. Because anyone can hit back when they're pushed. That's just biology, just reaction, just the oldest program running in the human brain. What is genuinely rare, what actually stops people cold and makes them retell a story for decades, is power that has no need to punish. Strength that doesn't celebrate its own use. Skill that acts only when required and immediately goes back to being invisible. That's the rarest thing in the world. And the sailors on that base recognized it even before they had words for it. Now here's something I want you to really sit with, because this next part is important. Steven Seagal's style of Aikido is built around a specific idea. The idea that conflict doesn't have to escalate. That the goal of a defender is not to destroy the attacker, but to neutralize the threat, redirect the energy, and restore balance. A true Aikido master doesn't finish a confrontation by standing over someone. They finish it by ending the danger and stepping back. That philosophy doesn't just live in the dojo. It doesn't stay behind training room walls. It lives in the person. It becomes the way they see every situation, every conflict, every moment where ego wants to take over, and real training has to be stronger than ego. When Seagal extended that hand, he wasn't just being polite. He was doing exactly what his training had shaped him to do. Neutralize. Restore balance. Step back. And that sailor? He stood up a different person than the one who had walked across that mess hall. You could see it in his face, people said. The color of it. The way his eyes were processing something he hadn't prepared for. He had walked over expecting to embarrass someone. He stood back up having learned something about the gap between what he thought he knew and what was actually in the room with him. That's a gift, actually, even if it didn't feel like one at the time. Let me ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If you were the sailor in that story, how would that moment have changed you? Would you have been angry, embarrassed, and defensive? Or would you have been able to look at it honestly and let it teach you something? There's no wrong answer here. Comment below, because the way we respond to being corrected by life says a lot about who we're becoming. Now let me take you a little deeper into who Steven Seagal actually was during this period of his life. Before the movies, before the action star image, before all of it, here was a man who had done something that required a rare combination of things. Discipline, cultural humility, an almost stubborn willingness to be a beginner in a world that had no patience for American beginners. He moved to Japan. He immersed himself completely. He didn't dabble. He didn't take a few classes and come home with a certificate. He lived inside that training the way you have to live inside something to truly understand it. And Aikido is particularly demanding in a specific way. It is not the most visually dramatic martial art. It doesn't always look impressive to someone watching from the outside. It doesn't have the flashy kicks of some styles or the raw power display of others. What it has is subtlety, timing, an understanding of physics and human balance that operates at a level most people never see, which is exactly why it is so often underestimated. Which is exactly why that sailor didn't think twice before putting his hands on someone who had trained in it for years. There is a lesson here that goes far beyond martial arts. The things in life that are actually most powerful are rarely the things that look the most impressive from the outside. Quiet confidence often reads as weakness. Patience gets mistaken for passivity. Depth looks like emptiness to someone who only recognizes surface. This is true of people. It's true of ideas. It's true of almost anything worth paying attention to. And sometimes the only way the world finds out it was wrong is when it accidentally tests something it didn't know was there. That day in the mess hall was a test, and the results were immediate. Now here's something that makes this story even more interesting. After this incident, Seagal's reputation on that base shifted completely. Not in a fearful way. Not in the way where people avoid someone because they're scared of them. In a different way. People started coming to him, asking questions, asking about training, asking about Aikido, asking what he had done and how. Some of the toughest men on that base, men who had trained for years in their own disciplines, found themselves genuinely curious about a form of martial art they had maybe never taken seriously before. That one encounter opened doors that no demonstration could have opened. No speech about technique, no display of credentials. Just one moment of genuine ability revealed under genuine pressure. And word kept spreading. Because the story was too good not to tell. Too complete. Too perfectly shaped. The arrogance that walked across a room. The invisible skill that met it. The grace that followed. That's a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that actually means something. That's a story that teaches something without ever announcing that it's trying to. Those are the stories that survive. That's why you're hearing it right now. I want to pause here and ask you something I've been thinking about through this whole story. We talk a lot about strength in obvious ways. The person who wins the fight. The person who dominates the room. The person who makes the most noise and gets the most attention. But what about the kind of strength that doesn't need any of that? What about the person who can be underestimated, challenged, even pushed, and respond with precision, and then immediately let it go? Is that stronger than the alternative? Or does part of you still feel like the person who makes the bigger display wins something? Comment below honestly, because I think the answer says a lot about where we are in our own lives. Back to that mess hall. Back to the moment after. The other sailors in that room had a choice to make in the minutes and hours after what they witnessed. They could treat it as entertainment, a story to tell, a funny incident that happened over lunch, or they could treat it as something that actually rearranged something in their thinking. Most of them, by all accounts, chose the second option, because seeing something real does that to you. Real skill, real character, real response under genuine pressure. It doesn't leave the same way entertainment does. Entertainment fades. Genuine witnessing stays. Those men went home that night and thought about what they saw. Some of them probably thought about their own assumptions, about who they had underestimated, about times they had mistaken quiet for empty, about the gap between confidence and competence, because those two things are not the same thing even though we treat them like they are. Confidence is how someone presents. Competence is what someone can actually do. The sailor had confidence. Seagal had competence. And 6 seconds was all it took for the difference to become completely obvious to everyone in the room. This is something worth thinking about in your own life, wherever you are right now. Are the people you're most impressed by actually the most capable? Or are they just the loudest? Are the people you're paying the least attention to possibly carrying something you haven't tested yet? Think about it. Really think about it. And if someone comes to mind, if someone in your life is quieter than you've given them credit for, maybe worth looking again. Let's come back now to the moment that started everything. That shove. It seems like such a small thing, doesn't it? One person puts their hands on another. Happens in a million places every day. Arguments that get physical. Ego that gets physical. Territory being tested. Social hierarchy being enforced through force. And almost every time it happens, the response is predictable. The shoved person either absorbs it and loses status in the room or pushes back and the situation escalates. Round and round the oldest human loop there is. What Seagal did broke the loop. He didn't absorb it. He redirected it. Instantly and completely. Without malice, without announcement, without a single wasted movement. And then he helped the man up. He stepped outside the entire system of the exchange. He didn't win the fight by fighting harder. He won it by operating from a completely different level of understanding than the one the fight was happening on. And that's what no one in that mess hall could quite put into words afterward. They just knew they had seen something different. Something they had never seen before. Something that made them quiet in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just deep. Real things do that to people. They make us quiet before we find the words. Now, I want to close this story the way it deserves to be closed. Not with a conclusion about Steven Seagal the movie star. Not about the career that followed. But about what this specific moment in a specific mess hall on a specific day tells us about how we move through the world. The sailor who shoved him walked across that room completely sure of something. Sure of the social dynamics. Sure of the hierarchy. Sure of himself. And all of that sureness was based on nothing more than surface information. On what things looked like. On who was loud and who was quiet. And life corrected that in 6 seconds. Now here's the final question I want to leave you with. Think about the person in your life who moves the quietest. Who doesn't make noise about what they know or what they can do. Who sits in the corner of the room, metaphorically speaking, and just watches while everyone else performs. Have you underestimated that person? Because somewhere in that quiet, there might be something you haven't tested yet. And the lesson of that mess hall, the lesson that those sailors never forgot, is simple. The ones who don't need to prove it are usually the ones who could. Tell me in the comments. Who came to mind when I asked that? And if this story hit something for you, something real, then you already know what the sailor learned on the floor of that mess hall. The loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. And the most dangerous one is almost never loud.